Hello, and welcome to Night Drive Stories. My name's Jack, and I drive the silent highways of the Pacific Northwest long after midnight, picking up those who wander these misty roads. Tonight, let me tell you the story I heard from the stranger I picked up just outside the old truck stop at mile marker 99. He was a man who seemed to be actively trying to shrink, to take up as little space as possible in the passenger seat of my car. He was rail thin, with a worn flannel shirt that hung on his frame, and his hands, clasped tightly in his lap, were pale and trembling slightly. But it was his eyes that told the real story. They were wide and haunted, and they were in constant, frantic motion, but not in the way of a man watching for danger on the road. He was checking his own existence. His gaze would dart down to his own arm, then to the dashboard, then to the faint reflection of his own face in the darkened window, as if he were taking a constant, terrified inventory of himself and his surroundings, desperate to confirm they were still there. He looked like a man who was terrified he might blink and find himself suddenly, completely alone in an empty void. He gave his name as Arthur, and when I asked him where he was heading, he just gave a weak, tired shrug. "Nowhere, really," he'd said, his voice a dry rustle of dead leaves. "Just away from where I was." It took nearly an hour of shared silence, the only sound the hypnotic rhythm of the tires on wet asphalt, before he finally turned to me, his gaze for once steady and filled with a terrible, unmoored grief, and decided to unburden himself. "Have you ever truly hated a place?" Arthur began, his voice a low, hesitant rumble that seemed to struggle against the profound silence he carried with him. "I don't mean dislike or find unpleasant. I mean a deep, instinctual cellular hatred. A feeling that a particular arrangement of wood and stone and soil is fundamentally wrong, that it's an enemy to your spirit, a place that actively wishes you ill just by existing. For me, that place is a house. My house. The one that isn't there anymore." He told me he had spent the last 15 years of his adult life successfully, meticulously, avoiding that place. He had built a life for himself in Chicago, a fortress of solitude in a world of concrete and steel and perfect right angles, a place as far removed from the damp, whispering, chaotic hollows of his youth as he could get. He was an architectural draftsman, a man who found a deep, almost spiritual comfort in the clean, predictable, rational lines of blueprints, in a world that could be contained, understood, and defined on paper. He had a quiet, minimalist apartment, a few casual, undemanding friends, a life that was deliberately, meticulously unremarkable. He had starved his past of oxygen, believing that if he never spoke of it, never thought of it, it would eventually wither and die. Then the letter came, he said, his gaze turning inward, to a memory that was clearly a fresh, weeping wound. It was out of place in my sterile metal mailbox, tucked between credit card offers and glossy catalogs. A thin, cheap envelope, the kind that feels brittle to the touch, made of that grayish paper that seems one step up from newsprint. The postmark was a faded, blurry purple stamp from a town that I was sure shouldn't even have a functioning post office anymore. Inside was a single typed sheet of paper from a county solicitor I'd never heard of. The type was faint, as if from an old ribbon. It informed me in the driest, most impersonal legalese imaginable that my grandfather, Alistair Pike, had passed away, and that I, Arthur Pike, being his sole surviving heir, was now the legal owner of the property at 14 Crow Hollow Road, Lost Creek, West Virginia. The news of his grandfather's death didn't stir much grief, only a faint phantom echo of a sadness he thought he'd outgrown. Alistair had been a ghost to him for most of his life, a remote, grim, silent figure he remembered from a handful of tense, obligatory childhood visits. He remembered a tall, gaunt man with hands stained with something that looked like rust, who smelled of damp earth and wood smoke, and who would stare at him with an unnerving, calculating intensity, as if measuring him for a suit he didn't want. What the letter stirred was a deep, cold, familiar dread. The thought of going back to that house, to that town, felt like a physical violation, like being forced to swallow poison. "Lost Creek," he said, the name itself a sigh of resignation, the taste of rust and rot in his mouth. "It's one of those forgotten little towns deep in the green, suffocating folds of the Appalachians, a place that time and the interstate highway system decided to bypass completely. It was a coal town once, a century ago, with a brief, brutal flicker of prosperity. Now it's just a scar. A collection of ramshackle, leaning houses and rusting single-wides, slowly, inexorably being swallowed by the kudzu and the deep, dark woods. The air there always smelled of wet leaves, of burning coal smoke even in the summer, and of rust. And the silence. It was a different kind of silence than you get in the deep wilderness. It was a heavy, watchful, listening silence. The sagging houses all seemed to be leaning in, eavesdropping on your thoughts. He had spent 2 weeks trying to ignore the letter, letting it sit on his clean, orderly desk like a piece of toxic waste. He tried to find a way to deal with the property remotely, to excise this tumor from his life with clean legal instruments. He called the solicitor's number printed on the letterhead, but it rang and rang before a recorded voice told him the number was no longer in service. He tried to hire a realtor from a larger town an hour away, but they all politely declined with a strange, uniform haste, making vague excuses about the property being inaccessible or out of their jurisdiction. It became clear that the world, or at least that small forgotten part of it, had conspired to make him go back in person. He told himself it was just for a weekend, a surgical strike. Drive down, hire a local to clear the place out, sign whatever papers were necessary, and be done with it. Sever the last rotting thread connecting him to his past and return to his clean, orderly life. "I remember the drive down," he said, his voice dropping, taking on a haunted quality. "The further I got from the interstate, the stranger the world became. The roads got narrower, the trees crowded in, their branches interlocking overhead to form a tunnel of deep green darkness. The radio, which had been a comforting babble of talk shows and pop music, slowly devolved into static, then fell completely silent. My phone lost its signal. It felt like I wasn't just driving to a different place, but to a different time, a place where the rules of the modern world had worn thin and something older and stranger still held sway." He described his arrival in Lost Creek. The town was even more dilapidated than he remembered, a collection of haunted-looking structures sinking back into the earth, their windows like vacant eyes. And then he saw the house. It stood at the end of a long, unpaved, deeply rutted road, on a small rise, set back from its few neighbors as if in quarantine. It wasn't a mansion, but it was large and imposing, a 2-story clapboard farmhouse that had been in his family for nearly 200 years. It was painted a faded, sickly yellow, the color of old bruises, and its windows, even in the bright afternoon daylight, looked like dark, vacant, staring eyes. An ancient, gnarled oak tree stood in the front yard, its branches like twisted, arthritic fingers reaching for the house, its roots buckling the very earth around the foundation. "The moment I saw it," Arthur whispered, a visible tremor running through his thin frame, "I felt it. The same deep primal feeling I'd had as a child. The one that made me physically ill. That the house was not just a building, that it was alive, and that it was aware. And that it hated me just as much as I hated it. It was an oppressive, silent entity, and my grandfather hadn't lived in it so much as he had been its keeper. Its long-suffering prisoner." He parked his car, a clean, late-model sedan that looked absurdly out of place, and walked to the front door. The key the solicitor had sent him, a heavy, old-fashioned skeleton key, turned in the lock with a rusty, grating shriek of protest. He pushed the door open, and a wave of cold, musty air washed over him, smelling of dust, of mice, of old paper, and something else. Something that reminded him of ozone. The sharp electric smell in the air after a lightning strike. He stepped across the threshold, feeling not like a homeowner returning, but like a trespasser entering a place where he was not welcome. He had come to sell the house, to be rid of it, but he already had the chilling, overpowering sense that the house had other plans for him. The inside of the house was a museum of profound decay and singular obsession. Every surface, the floors, the tables, the mantelpiece, was covered in a thick, undisturbed, almost velvety layer of gray dust, making the rooms feel soft and soundless, like a tomb sealed for centuries. The furniture was old and heavy, dark, brooding wood monstrosities that seemed to drink the weak, hazy light that filtered through the grimy, warped window panes. His grandfather, it was immediately starkly clear, had not been a man concerned with comfort or aesthetics. He had been a man concerned with other, stranger things. I spent the first day just trying to breathe, Arthur recounted, his shoulders hunching as if he could still feel the oppressive, physical weight of the house's atmosphere. The air was thick, heavy, like it had been trapped in there for a century and had grown stale and unhappy. But it was the silence that was the worst. It was an active, listening silence. It had a texture. It was the kind of silence that makes the small ambient sounds, the creak of a floorboard upstairs as the house settled, the frantic scuttling of a mouse in the wall, sound like gunshots in a library. I couldn't shake the feeling that my every move was being monitored, cataloged by something unseen, that the house itself was watching me through the dusty air. He started his grim work in his grandfather's study, a small, claustrophobic room lined from floor to ceiling with bookshelves that groaned and sagged under the weight of rotting, leather-bound volumes. He was looking for a deed, a title, any legal document that would allow him to put the property on the market and leave this place forever. Instead, he found the first signs of his grandfather's descent into madness, or what he then believed to be madness. The books weren't on history or literature or farming. They were arcane, esoteric texts, some in languages he didn't recognize, on forgotten astronomy, on sacred geometry, on bizarre fringe theories of architecture and acoustics and resonance. Titles like The Unstable Edifice and Geometries of the Void and Harmonic Containment Theory. And then he started to feel the hum. At first, I thought it was just the old rattling refrigerator in the kitchen, or maybe the ancient electrical wiring in the walls buzzing, he said, his voice dropping. It was a low, deep, bass note hum, so deep it was more a feeling than a sound. I could feel it vibrating up through the thick soles of my shoes, a steady, rhythmic, almost organic thrumming in my bones. Thrum, thrum, thrum. It was like a great, slow, sleeping heart, beating somewhere deep in the earth beneath the house. I went down to the cellar, thinking it might be a generator or a sump pump, but the sound was actually fainter down there. It was centered in the house itself. The house was humming. As night fell, and the world outside the grimy windows dissolved into a perfect rural blackness, the strangeness escalated. Doors he was certain he had closed would be standing slightly ajar when he turned around. The rhythmic creaking from the floorboards upstairs began to sound less random and more like a slow, deliberate, heavy pacing, back and forth, back and forth. And then came the whispers. He was sitting in a dusty, threadbare armchair in the living room, trying to work up the courage to go to sleep when he first heard it. It was a faint, dry, sibilant sound from within the walls, like fine sand being poured down a long wooden chute, or like the ghostly sound of someone speaking backwards. There were no discernible words, just the unsettling, insidious texture of a voice where no voice should be. The next day, driven by a mixture of rising fear and a desperate need for answers, he began a more thorough, frantic search of the house. He wasn't looking for a deed anymore. He was looking for an explanation. In a locked roll-top desk in the study, a desk he had to force open with a crowbar, he found them. A hidden collection of his grandfather's journals, dozens of them, bound in cracking dry leather, stretching back over 50 years. They weren't diaries in any normal sense, Arthur explained, his voice hushed with the remembered awe and terror of his discovery. They were logbooks, the meticulous, obsessive, scientific-looking records of a man engaged in a lifelong, secret, solitary war. The pages were filled with his spidery, frantic, almost illegible handwriting. But it wasn't just words. There were pages and pages of diagrams. Strange, complex astronomical charts that didn't match any known constellations. Incredibly detailed, cross-sectioned architectural drawings of the house's foundation, showing a bizarre, labyrinthine structure that made no engineering sense. And there were geometric patterns, intricate, mandala-like symbols, drawn with a compass and ruler that made my eyes ache to look at them for too long, like they were optically poisonous. But it was the written entries that chilled him to his core, that began to peel back the veil on the house's terrible secret. They were filled with cryptic, repeated phrases, recorded over and over again, year after year, with a ritualistic consistency. October 14, 1978. The alignment is near. The humming is stronger tonight, a full 2 octaves lower than last year. The anchor phrase, the structure, groans. October 15, 1982. a new crack in the cellar foundation, shaped like a spiral. The hollow listens for silence. It despises the noise of existence. The recitation must be perfect this time. October 14th, 1995. My hands tremble more each year. I grow weaker. The words are harder to remember, harder to form. Who will tend the anchor when I am gone? Who will speak the words? The journals made it horrifyingly, undeniably clear. The strange phenomena in the house, the doors that opened on their own, the cold spots that seemed to move from room to room, the rhythmic humming, were not signs of a common haunting, not the work of a restless spirit. They were something else entirely. They were symptoms of a deeper, more fundamental metaphysical instability. The house wasn't haunted by a ghost. It was haunted by itself. It was sick with a kind of spatial cancer, and his grandfather hadn't been its owner. He had been its doctor, prescribing a strange, esoteric medicine that was now finally failing. The final entry, from just a few weeks before his death, was a single shaky, terrifying sentence that was clearly addressed to him. Arthur must come. The house knows he is the last. The blood remembers the duty, even if the man has forgotten. He is the last. Arthur remembered slamming the journal shut, a cloud of ancient dust exploding into the air. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. He had come here to sever his ties to this place, to cut the final thread. But the journals were telling him that the thread was not one of history or property, but of blood. And that it was not something he could cut, but a rope that was now being tied around his own neck, pulling him down, drowning him in his family's dark, secret, and inescapable legacy. He finally understood why his grandfather had never left this house, why the old man had died here, alone, in this dusty, humming, whispering tomb. He hadn't had a choice. And now, Arthur was beginning to realize with a sickening, cold certainty. Neither did he. The discovery of the journals was a turning point, a moment when the story of the house ceased to be about clearing out a dead relative's property and became a desperate, terrifying archaeological dig into the ruins of his own family's history. He spent the next day and the long, humming night that followed devouring his grandfather's words, the spidery, frantic script becoming the only reality that mattered. The house around him continued its slow, rhythmic breathing, the whispers in the walls growing more insistent and shaping themselves into sounds that were almost his name. But he barely noticed. He was lost in the horrifying, impossible story that the journals told. It was all there, Arthur said, his voice a mixture of awe at his ancestors' strange genius and revulsion at their legacy. 150 years of carefully documented, ritualized madness. The true story of my family. The story of the house. I learned that my ancestor, a man named Silas Pike, had built the house in the early 1800s. And Silas wasn't a farmer or a miner or a simple pioneer. He was what he called a natural philosopher, but what we would call a physicist, a geologist, and a madman all rolled into one. He was a student of what he called geodetic resonance and spatial disharmony. He was, in modern terms, a crackpot, a man obsessed with the esoteric idea that not all places on Earth were created equal, that the very fabric of reality was not uniform. According to Silas's strange, complex theories, which his grandfather had quoted at length in the journals, the fabric of reality was like a vast woven tapestry. There were places where it was strong, thick, and stable, and there were places where the weave was thin, weak, and unstable due to underlying cosmic stresses. These weak points, Silas had called them transient loci, were like geological faults, but on a metaphysical level. They were places where the barrier between our world and something else was dangerously, almost non-existent. Silas, using strange, divining rod-like instruments of his own invention made from alloys of copper and human bone, had spent years searching for just such a place. And he had found the most potent, most unstable one he ever could have imagined in that remote, dark, forgotten hollow in the West Virginia mountains. He didn't build the house there by accident, Arthur explained, his voice tight with the remembered horror of the revelation. He built it there on purpose. The house wasn't a home, it was an instrument, a complex, multi-layered research station, an anchor dropped into a stormy, metaphysical sea. Silas believed that this specific spot, this transient locus, didn't connect to another world, another dimension, in the way we might think of it from science fiction. There were no aliens, no monsters. It connected to nothing. A void. A formless, timeless, silent, thinking emptiness that he called the Hollow. And it was an active void. The Hollow, according to the journals, was not malevolent, not in a way a human could understand it. It wasn't evil. It was simply hungry. It was a state of pure non-existence, of absolute silence and simplicity, that naturally, by its very nature, sought to expand. It was an entropy so pure it was sentient. It worked to erase the complexity and the noise and the messiness of existence, and replace it with its own perfect, featureless, silent uniformity. The house that Silas Pike had built was designed, architecturally, geometrically, and materially, to act as a dam, a bulwark against this encroaching cosmological nothingness. Its strange non-Euclidean angles, its off-center rooms, its deep labyrinthine foundation filled with resonating chambers. It was all designed to reinforce reality in this one specific weak spot. But the house alone wasn't enough. It was just a shell. It needed a human component. It needed a living, breathing, believing consciousness to perpetually maintain its existence, to tell the universe that it was supposed to be there. And that terrible duty fell to the Pike bloodline. For generations, Arthur whispered, the weight of the revelation clear in his voice, his words heavy with the burden of his lineage. The men of my family have acted as anchors. They weren't living in the house. They were powering it with their own lives, their own minds, their own blood. Their entire existence was dedicated to a single vital task, to perform a complex annual ritual on a specific night of a rare astronomical alignment. My grandfather called it the recitation of permanence. It was a way of reminding the universe of the house's story, of its history, of its very right to exist, and in doing so, reinforcing its reality and keeping the Hollow at bay for one more year. The ritual, as described in painstaking detail in the journals, was a terrifyingly complex and precise affair. It involved the specific placement of the strange objects he had yet to find, a long, difficult litany of strange, guttural words that were not from any known language, and an absolute, unbroken connection of blood to the house itself. The anchor had to be of Pike blood. A single mistake, a single misspoken word, a moment of lapsed concentration during the hours-long rite, and the ritual would fail. The anchor would sever. The house would be lost. The journals were filled with chilling, matter-of-fact cautionary tales, Arthur said, his voice dropping. My great-uncle Josiah, who, devastated by the death of his wife, tried to perform the ritual while drunk on whiskey and vanished from the house mid-chant, never to be seen again. A distant cousin in the 1920s who, upon learning his fate, refused the duty and fled to Philadelphia. They found him weeks later in a boarding house, his mind completely gone, a babbling, empty shell who didn't even recognize his own name. The Hollow had found him and erased him anyway. This wasn't a choice. It was a sentence, a life sentence of being the solitary, secret guardian of a crumbling metaphysical dam, holding back an ocean of absolute nothing. As I listened to him, Jack, a thought occurred to me. His story, this hidden, secret history of a single, tragic family fighting a lonely cosmic war in a forgotten corner of Appalachia, is the very essence of what we explore here on Night Drive Stories. We search for the tales that fall through the cracks of the known world, the truths that hide in the forgotten corners of the American landscape. If you, like Arthur's ancestor Silas, believe that the world is more complex and stranger and more fragile than the official maps show, and you want to explore it with me, then take a moment to subscribe to the channel. You never know when you might need a guide through the dark, thin places. Arthur continued, his voice heavy with the final dawning horror of his situation. The journals made it all terrifyingly clear. With my grandfather gone, the anchor was not just fraying, it was broken. The humming, the whispers, the moving doors, they were the sounds of reality starting to unravel at the seams. I was the last of the Pike bloodline. My father had died young, before this burden could be passed to him. It had skipped a generation. And the night of the astronomical alignment, the night the recitation had to be performed, was tomorrow. I was the last anchor, and the duty, the terrible, impossible duty, was now mine. He had gone to Lost Creek to sell a house, and he had discovered that he had to save it, and himself, from being utterly and completely erased from existence. The final 24 hours leading up to the ritual were a spiraling descent into a very specific and personal hell. The house, which now seemed to Arthur to be a living, dying thing, appeared to sense the approaching deadline, its strange phenomena intensifying with each passing hour, as if in a fever. The low, deep hum that vibrated through the floorboards grew in volume and intensity, becoming a constant, oppressive, physical thrum that made the fillings in Arthur's teeth ache, and his vision seemed to shimmer at the edges. The whispers in the walls were no longer sibilant and indistinct. They were beginning to sound like coherent words spoken in a language he almost understood, tugging at the edges of his comprehension, promising secrets, promising release, if he would only stop what he was doing and listen closer. The physical manifestations became more overt, more aggressive. He would place a book on a table, turn his back for a moment, and hear it crash to the floor across the room. A coffee mug he was holding slid slowly, deliberately out of his hand and shattered on the linoleum. A window in the upstairs bedroom cracked from top to bottom, for no reason at all. He felt as if the house, or the hollow that was infecting it, was testing him, trying to break his concentration, trying to make him flee in terror before he could even attempt the ritual that would bind it to reality for another year. "I didn't sleep a wink," Arthur told me, his voice a raw, strained whisper, the sound of a man who hadn't slept properly in years. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the complex geometric diagrams from my grandfather's journals burned onto the inside of my eyelids, swirling and rearranging themselves. I spent the entire day pacing the dusty floors of the house, memorizing the recitation. It was a long, rambling, multi-page chant that was full of impossible guttural sounds and tongue-twisting phrases that felt unnatural to a human throat. I practiced the specific ritualistic movements described in the book, a slow, deliberate dance, a kind of ceremonial tai chi that had to be performed with absolute precision. Every step, every hand gesture, had to be perfect. I felt like an actor rehearsing for the most important play in history, a play where a single missed cue would bring the entire theater crashing down, not just on me, but on the very concept of the theater itself. His grandfather's journals were his only guide, his only hope, his script for this terrible performance. They instructed him on where to find the hidden ritual chamber, the house's true heart. It was in the cellar, behind a section of the damp stone foundation that was, in fact, a cleverly disguised, perfectly balanced door. He found it after hours of searching, and pushing it open, he was met with a gust of air that was colder than a grave and smelled of charged ozone and damp, ancient, sterile earth. The room beyond was small, perfectly circular, and lined not with stone, but with some kind of dark, strange, non-reflective, seamless metal that seemed to absorb the light from his flashlight, making the space feel both claustrophobic and infinite at the same time. In the center of the room was a low, cylindrical pedestal, and on it, the ritual objects, untouched for a year, just as the journals had described. They were the strangest, most incongruous things I'd ever seen, he said, his voice full of a lingering, fearful awe. There was a large, heavy, rust-colored lodestone, a natural magnet that felt strangely warm and alive to the touch. There was an old, beautiful, brass-cased compass, but its needle wasn't pointing north. It was spinning wildly, erratically, like it was trying to point in every direction at once. There was a large steel tuning fork, but when I struck it against the pedestal, it produced no sound at all, only a profound, vibrating silence that seemed to cancel out all other noise in the room, a pocket of pure quiet. And finally, there was a small, corked glass vial containing a dark, viscous, almost black liquid. A faded handwritten label on it read, "Alistair Pike, the penultimate anchor." It was my grandfather's blood, saved and preserved for this very purpose. The journals explained the horrifyingly personal, intimate nature of the ritual. It required not just the objects and the words, but a blood sacrifice. A small one, just a few drops, to be mixed with the preserved blood of the previous anchor and used to anoint the lodestone, the true geological heart of the house's anchor. It was a way of reaffirming the bloodline's connection to the house and the land, a way of telling the universe, in its own fundamental language, we are still here. This place is still ours. You cannot have it. As the hour of the astronomical alignment approached, an hour his grandfather had marked with a star chart in the journal, Arthur's terror reached a fever pitch. The humming of the house was now a deep, resonant roar that shook the very foundations, the glasses in the cupboards rattling in sympathy. The whispers were a constant, seductive, mocking chorus, calling his name from the darkness, telling him to give up. He gathered his courage, what little he had left, took the objects, the journal propped open to the right page, and a small, sharp paring knife from the kitchen, and descended into the hidden silent chamber. The ritual was a nightmare of complexity, he recounted, his body tensing in my passenger seat with the muscle memory of that night. It had multiple intricate stages. I had to place the objects on specific, faintly glowing sigil-marked points on the floor that corresponded to the diagrams in the book. I had to strike the silent tuning fork at precise intervals, creating waves of quiet that washed over the room. I had to walk the perimeter of the room counterclockwise, reciting different parts of the chant, my voice cracking and hoarse. The air in the room grew colder and colder, a deep, unnatural chill that had nothing to do with the cellar, and the compass needle spun faster and faster, a blur of motion. I felt an immense, unseen pressure building around me, the psychic pressure of the hollow, of that great silent nothingness pushing against the fragile walls of reality, sensing its opportunity, sensing weakness. He came to the final critical stage, the bloodletting. With a trembling, sweaty hand, he pricked his own thumb with the paring knife, squeezing a few drops of his own bright red blood into the vial with his grandfather's old dark liquid. As his blood mixed with the old, the lodestone in the center of the room began to glow, just as the journal had said it would, with a faint, pulsing, deep red light, like a dying ember being brought back to life. It was working. The anchor was reforming. All he had to do was complete the final stanza of the recitation, the most complex and important part, while anointing the glowing stone with the combined blood. He took a deep breath and began to chant, his voice shaking, the strange, guttural words feeling alien and monstrous in his mouth. He was halfway through the final line, his hand reaching out with the vial to touch the lodestone, when he stumbled. His foot, numb with cold and tension, caught on an uneven part of the floor, a misstep of less than an inch. But it was enough. He lurched forward, his concentration shattering for a single, fatal second. He mispronounced a word, a hard, clicking glottal sound coming out as a soft, breathy, simple one. It was a tiny mistake, he whispered, his voice full of an eternal, echoing, self-loathing regret. A single, stupid, insignificant syllable. But in a ritual of absolute, unforgiving precision, a tiny mistake is the same as a total, catastrophic failure. The moment the wrong sound left his lips, everything stopped. The deep humming of the house ceased instantly. The whispers in the walls fell silent. The red glow of the lodestone winked out, plunging the room into near-total darkness. The compass needle stopped spinning and pointed to a dead, meaningless spot on the floor. And a new, perfect silence descended upon the room, a silence far more profound and terrifying than any that had come before. It was a dead, flat, absolute silence, the sound of a connection being utterly, finally severed. It was the sound of nothing winning. In the fundamental language of the house, he had just said, "I give up." He felt a profound, sickening snap in the atmosphere, as if a great, ancient, cosmic rope under immense tension had just been cut. He had failed. The anchor was broken, for good. Exhausted, defeated and overwhelmed by a sense of dread so profound it felt like a physical illness, a cancer of the soul, Arthur stumbled out of the now dead silent ritual chamber. The house was utterly still. The oppressive, watchful, humming atmosphere was gone, replaced by something far worse, a complete and total emptiness, a sterile vacuum. It felt like a corpse now, its strange, malevolent, animating spirit having finally, completely fled. It was just a collection of rotting wood and dusty furniture. He made his way back upstairs, his legs as heavy as lead, his mind a hollow, ringing chamber of his own failure. He didn't have the energy to leave, to run. There was nowhere to run to anymore. He collapsed onto his grandfather's dusty bed, fully clothed, and fell into a deep, troubled, mercifully dreamless sleep. The sleep of a man who has just been condemned and is simply waiting for the sentence to be carried out. He woke with a violent gasp, not to the familiar sight of the dusty bedroom ceiling, but to the feeling of cold, damp earth beneath his cheek and a sky the color of old pewter, thick and featureless above him. He was lying on the ground, outside. A fine, gray, cold mist clung to him, soaking his clothes, beating in his hair. He sat up, his mind thick with a disorienting, terrifying confusion. His first thought was that he had somehow sleepwalked out of the house in his exhausted state and collapsed in the yard. It was a rational, if strange, explanation. But as his vision cleared and he scrambled to his feet, a wave of vertigo and pure, unadulterated reality-bending horror washed over him. The house was gone. It wasn't a ruin. It wasn't a pile of rubble from a sudden collapse. It wasn't a smoking crater. It was simply, utterly, completely gone. The ancient, gnarled oak tree that had dominated the front yard, the one that had been there for 300 years, gone. The gravel driveway where he had parked his car, gone. His silver Toyota sedan, gone. The old, tilting, rusted mailbox at the end of the drive with the name Pike peeling off the side, gone. The very ground he had known, the familiar grass and weeds and dirt of the property that his family had occupied for 2 centuries, was gone. In its place was a perfect, geometrically precise circle of something else. A patch of alien wilderness that had been surgically, flawlessly inserted into the familiar Appalachian landscape. The ground he was standing on at the very edge of this circle was wrong. The grass was a vibrant, unnatural shade of blue-green, slick and cool, and almost slimy to the touch, like seaweed. The soil beneath it was dark and loamy and friable, but it smelled not of the familiar, rich earth of the mountains, but of something metallic and sterile, like a mineral he had never encountered before. Strange, pale, phosphorescent fungi grew in tight, geometric clusters on the ground, pulsing with a faint, sickly internal light. And the trees. The circle was dotted with a small copse of trees of no species he recognized from any textbook. They were tall and slender and disturbingly symmetrical, with smooth, bone-white bark that looked like polished porcelain, and leaves that were a deep, dark, almost black purple, which absorbed the light, casting no shadows beneath them. And the silence. The silence he had felt in the house after the failed ritual was now absolute, and all-encompassing within this circle. There was no birdsong, no chirp of crickets or whine of insects, no rustle of leaves in the wind, because there was no wind. The air within this patch of wrongness was dead still, stagnant, cold, and thin. He had not just woken up to find his house missing. He had woken up to find himself ejected from his own reality, standing on the border of a wound in the world. A cancerous, silent patch of the hollow that had finally, after centuries of being held at bay, consumed his ancestral home. He walked, trembling, to the edge of the circle, his heart pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm against his ribs. The demarcation between the worlds was sharp, unnatural, perfect. He could see the familiar, weathered, potholed asphalt of Crow Hollow Road right in front of him, and it simply stopped. It ended at a razor-sharp, perfect line, beyond which lay this strange, new, silent land where his house should be. It was as if a giant cosmic cookie cutter had descended from the sky and replaced a piece of his world with a piece of another, a piece from a puzzle that didn't fit. He stood there for what felt like hours, a statue of terror, paralyzed by the sheer, magnificent logical horror of it, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. This was not a landslide. This was not a sinkhole. This was an erasure, a deletion. The house had not been destroyed. It had been unmade. The space it occupied, the very coordinates of its existence, had been overwritten with a new, blank, silent geography. He was a castaway, a refugee, standing on the shore of his own vanished history. Finally, the paralysis broke, shattered by a surge of pure animal panic. He turned and ran. He ran from the silent alien circle of land, down the familiar, cracked asphalt of the road, away from the place where his home, his car, his past used to be. He didn't know where he was going. He was just running, his lungs burning, his mind screaming, a man trying to outrun a hole in the universe. He had come to this place to confront his past, and in return, his past, his present, and his future had been stolen from him in a single, silent, terrible night. He was no longer Arthur Pike, owner of the house at 14 Crow Hollow Road. He was Arthur Pike, the man whose home, whose entire world, had been eaten by the silence. Arthur ran until his lungs were on fire and his legs gave out from sheer exhaustion, finally collapsing on the gravel shoulder at the edge of Lost Creek's main street. He lay there for a long time in the morning mist, gasping for air. The impossible, indelible image of the silent, alien circle of land burned into the back of his mind. He was a man adrift in his own life, his only anchor to the world, his ancestral home, now gone, replaced by a terrible, silent void. In a state of frantic, desperate shock, he did the only thing a sane person could do when faced with the utterly, demonstrably insane. He sought out the authorities. He sought out consensus reality. He went to find the sheriff. The sheriff's office was a small, dusty, cramped room in the town's crumbling, water-stained municipal building. The sheriff himself, a man named Henderson, was old and weary, with kind, tired, bloodshot eyes that had seen every kind of mundane human tragedy the dying town had to offer over the past 40 years. He listened patiently, nodding slowly, as Arthur, disheveled, mud-stained, and wild-eyed, babbled his impossible story. He told him everything: the house, the journals, the humming, the secret ritual, and the waking up on cold, strange ground to find everything, his house, his car, his world, gone. Henderson just nodded slowly the whole time, Arthur recounted, his voice full of the remembered sting of that gentle, well-meaning dismissal. He didn't call me crazy. He didn't laugh. He just looked at me with a profound, weary pity, the way you'd look at a stray dog that had been hit by a car and was now limping and confused. When I finished, he took a long sip from a chipped ceramic mug and said, "Son, you've been through a lot. Your grandpa passed. You're all alone out here. This town, this house. They have a way of getting inside a person's head. The mind can play powerful tricks on you in a place like this, especially in that old Pike house. It's always had a reputation for being unwelcoming." He then offered to drive me out there, to show me that everything was all right, that my mind was just playing tricks on me. Arthur agreed, clinging to a desperate, insane sliver of hope that he had imagined it all, that he had suffered a breakdown from the stress and the grief. They got into the sheriff's old, dusty, squeaking cruiser and drove the few miles back to Crow Hollow Road. As they pulled up to the property line, Arthur felt a wave of nausea so intense he almost threw up. From his position in the passenger seat, he could see it perfectly. The silent, unnatural circle of wrongness, the bone-white trees, the slick, blue-green grass. But the sheriff saw something else entirely. He stopped the car, Arthur said, his voice cracking with the memory of the sheer, surreal horror of that moment, and he just pointed a thick, work-worn finger through the windshield. "See, son," he said, his voice gentle and reassuring. "It's right there, a little run down, sure. The old man let it go these last few years. It needs a coat of paint and some new gutters, but it's still standing. Your car's right there in the driveway, just where you left it." I looked where he was pointing. I forced myself to follow his gaze, and my blood ran cold. He was seeing the house. The old, sagging, yellow, dilapidated, but very much real and solid house. He saw the gnarled oak tree. He saw my silver Toyota. He saw the world as it was supposed to be. In a daze, Arthur got out of the cruiser and walked toward his property. Sheriff Henderson followed a few paces behind, his hand resting on his hip, his posture that of a man dealing with someone deeply unwell. For the sheriff, he was watching Arthur walk up a familiar gravel driveway toward a normal house. For Arthur, he was walking across a patch of silent, alien wilderness. He reached the spot where the front door should have been and just stopped. For him, there was nothing there but a patch of strange, dark, metallic-smelling soil. He tried to take another step, to walk into the space where the living room should be, but he couldn't. He was met with an invisible, immovable, perfectly flat barrier. He pressed his hands against it. It was like pushing against a wall of cold, solid glass that wasn't there. He could see through it, to the other side of the alien copse of trees, but he could not pass. The sheriff just saw me standing in the middle of the front yard, pushing against thin air like a deranged mime. Arthur whispered. He just shook his head sadly, walked up to me, put a gentle hand on my shoulder and said, "Come on, son. Let's get you out of here." He told me I needed to get some rest, to get away from this place for a while. He drove me to a bus station in the next county over. He was kind. He thought I was having a nervous breakdown, grieving. He had no idea what he was really looking at. The horrifying, isolating truth settled upon Arthur in that moment. The hollow hadn't just erased the house. It had erased it for him. It had severed his connection, his claim, his place in its history. The world a step to his left, the sheriff's world, was the real world. The world a step to his right, his world, was the one with the hole in it. And he was locked out of the consensus reality that everyone else shared, a ghost in his own life. "And that was the beginning of my life now," he said, his story finally arriving in the present, in the dark cab of my car on a lonely highway in Oregon. "I've been drifting ever since. I can't stay anywhere for too long. I can't form connections. I can't own anything I'm not prepared to lose. Because the hollow, it didn't just take the house. When the anchor broke, it attached itself to me. I am the anchor now, but I'm not anchoring a place to reality. I'm just a loose thread it's pulling on to unravel my own existence." He explained the final, terrifying aspect of his curse. He would find a town, get a small, anonymous apartment, a menial job. And for a few weeks, everything would be normal. Then, the small things would start. A favorite coffee mug would vanish from his cupboard. A photograph of his parents he kept in his wallet would one day be a blank piece of overexposed photo paper. Then bigger things. Mail would stop arriving, return to sender with address unknown. His landlord would look at him with a vague, confused expression, not quite remembering his name, asking if he'd paid his deposit yet. New acquaintances, people he'd had a beer with the night before, would forget they'd ever met him. "The hollow is following me," he said, his voice a dead, emotionless whisper of pure resignation. "It's still erasing, but it's erasing me. My footprint on the world. One memory, one connection, one object at a time. It's a slow, patient, methodical process. But it's thorough." He finally turned and looked at me, and his eyes were filled with a terrible, pleading, existential question. "So, I have to keep moving. I have to stay ahead of it. Because I don't know what happens when it's finished. I don't know what happens when there's nothing left of me to erase. Do I just cease to be winked out of existence? Or do I wake up one morning on a patch of cold, strange ground, under a gray sky, having been finally, completely evicted from the world for good?" He had no answer, and neither did I. I drove him to a crossroads where another highway split off to the south. He got out and thanked me, not for the ride, but for listening, for in some small way, reaffirming his existence for a few more hours by sharing his story. I watched him walk down the on-ramp and disappear into the misty darkness, a man whose past was being systematically devoured, walking toward a future that might just be a perfect, silent, featureless void. And I drove on, wondering how many other thin places there are in the world, and how many other people are just one misspoken word away from being completely and utterly erased.